Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, wonderful. I'm just going to start my timer. Yeah, last one up. It's been wonderful to listen to all your papers. I've learned a great deal during these past few days. I am going to read from my paper if that's okay. So this paper is definitely under development as I'm in the process of submitting my first book about memory of the Kindertransport in national and transnational perspective. So it looks at memorials, exhibitions, commemoration in Britain, Germany, Australia, America, New Zealand and Canada, and a little bit of Austria. However, there is a connection between the book and this paper, and what I'm going to discuss today, my new theory I've called personal transnational memory, and the testimony archive I've created of over 100 interviews is mentioned in the book, but it's really the focus of the second book. And then the third book is looking at sort of a transnational history of the Kindertransport. I'm moving away from memory at this point. And it looks at redefining the Kindertransport. We think of the Kindertransport as a story of survival and rescue, but actually it's one of suicides and murder as well. We talked about whether the Kindertransportees are survivors and recognised, do they call themselves survivors? And some of the kinder that went to other countries, such as France, for example, were deported. They fled and then were later interned and deported. So that's a story that we're bringing into that book. So my paper discusses memory of the Kindertransport. In popular imagination, the Kindertransport is understood as the rescue of about 10,000 mainly Jewish children from Nazi Germany and Austria to Britain between 1938 and 1940. But in fact, some children also came from Poland and Czechoslovakia, and many of the 10,000 came not to Britain but found refuge in France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland or Sweden. So is 10,000 the right number? Among other countries. The Kindertransport was thus a transnational event. This is underscored by the fact that the rescued children often had to endure several journeys across borders. A number of children who reached Britain, for instance, were, after the outbreak of war, deported to internment camps in Australia and Canada, or immigrated onto America during the Second World War as far as it was possible. And I've just learnt a story from the audience about a Kindertransportee that came to Britain from Vienna, who in 1940 went to the Dominican Republic and then to Israel in 1950. After the war, the children, usually known by the German term Kinder, moved again, often in the course of being reunited with those family members who had survived, and some did come to Israel, and that's a whole new story that I need to talk about on another paper. So in the book I'm about to discuss, or rather about to submit, with my former PhD supervisor, Professor Bill Niven, who has a chapter on the German perspective, we reflect upon how memory of the Kindertransport has moved from one country to another, or rather travelled. So travelling memory, Astrid Earl, if you're familiar with. Don't have time to go into detail about this, but in the book we're looking at, or rather writing about the differences between collective and personal memory. Just to give you a very whistle-stop tour, the developments in Kindertransport memory, testimony was sort of co-opted by the end of the war to support an institutional narrative about successful rescue and adaptation. In the 60s, when we first have like these autobiographical volumes that come out, they're talking about still not feeling at home and still feeling like a refugee, and it's such a more critical and transnational perspective. And then in the 90s we have a more positive perspective. There's a group mentality and identity, they feel more settled, and we start to see the development of national memory, which I have no time to go into. But you can see from this, the Kindertransport fits into different national memories very differently. And this also is something to do with testimony as well. Testimony in the 90s, which was incorporated into the first exhibitions, is very positive. We don't really see any of, you know, I didn't have a great time here, or I was interned. Those narratives just aren't there in the early exhibitions, though I have been told they were here in the first Israeli exhibitions. And more recently, there's been a more critical turn and there's lots of reasons why that is with regards to autobiographies, for example. So in the other book, we've looked at different national memories of the Kindertransport, how testimony is used across the genres I've talked about, how they confirm or challenge these national narratives, and how the genres themselves use testimony or, you know, incorporate it in different ways. So I haven't got time to talk about that, but that's a part of the book. So the actual book that I'm doing now, the collective was hard to pin down at first because it suggests that there is some affiliation to a group that extends beyond the boundaries of the nation. But if we identify a number of remembering groups that span borders, for example, the Kindertransport Association, international institutions and museums, charities such as World Jewish Relief, all operate across national borders. And I'm so sorry I can't remember the name of the lady that gave a talk about the online second-gen groups. This is also a digital form of transnational memory moving across boundaries. So the personal was more obvious from the start. I was aware of autobiographies, Hannah Zack Miley, who you can see in the photo here. Within 4 pages, she jumps through 4 different time zones. So these were more obvious from the start. So then I thought, okay, well, I can see this in the autobiographies. What is this like in the oral testimonies? So I started to begin interviewing Kinder. So I've been interviewing Kinder and I witnessed them recalling their transnational experiences. So in the first book, we wanted to define the concept of personal transnational memory and distinguish it from any collective notion of transnational memory. Though, of course, there are certain overlaps as individuals partake of the collective memory, help to shape it, and their memories can be presented in the interest of the collective understanding of a group. In the second book, I wanted to focus specifically on testimony and open this out to focus on interviews between different generations and survivors of other genocides. So I've used the term personal transnational memory, there we go, to characterise the subjective memory of Kindertransportees. Many Kinder possess personal transnational memory because their mental worlds focus on both host nation and country of origin. Because some Kinder arrived in several homelands, Britain to Australia, to Israel, for example, their points of arrival, transfer and departure are constantly seen in relation to one another. The Kinder's personal transnational memories bring a sensitivity to human distress, highlighted through their full range of experiences: the rupture of the family before the Kindertransport, the separation of siblings, adapting to different circumstances, interment, suicides, domestic service, evacuation, wartime experiences, movements beyond the Kindertransports, reunions, and creating new families, having careers, and so on and so on. Unlike the historiography, which presents the chronology of events, the Kinder's memories move forwards and backwards in time and space. They zigzag. There is a sense then of moving beyond boundaries, both past and present. This interchange of thoughts often revolves around the themes of loss, parting and relocation. Loss is part of the Kinder's condition and therefore drives their memories. While loss could be presented in a chronological way, the theme of loss often binds memories together in a way which it makes it difficult to separate the processes of departure, arrival and return. The Kinder do not only recall their own traumatic, geographical and emotional upheaval, as they are also aware of other personal transnational journeys, their parents, their siblings, their cousins, their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents and friends. These other stories are seen in parallel with their own. This reflects the broader diasporic experience of the Kindertransport, as the Kinder did not forget about what was happening to their loved ones. While we argue that personal transnational memory exists within the Kinder's own internal worlds, we become aware of this through engaging with their testimonies, interviews, autobiographies, autofiction, artworks, memorials they've dedicated, the work that they carry out within the community, reunions where they come together to share their stories, their own personal archives, and where their testimonies are incorporated into exhibitions. And I would argue that more recent exhibitions are really picking up on this, older ones not so much. More recently, Kinder have shared their testimonies with survivors of other genocides. So I've interviewed Kinder with Bosnian refugees, for example. This meeting of different personal transnational memories of different atrocities can lead survivors to further develop a stronger sense of self in relation to their own transnational experiences, because in listening to how others cope and learn from their experiences, they can apply similar lessons. Have I missed a slide? No, I'm good. Kinder then draw wider ethical conclusions from their transnational experiences. They help to raise an awareness of the issues which arise from their memories. They reflect upon what we are remembering as the key elements of the Kindertransport. Kindertransport testimony partakes of the transnational trends towards cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust, whereby memory of Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust contribute to the growth of human rights discourse. Kinder have used their testimony as a platform to encourage us to be more sympathetic towards refugees today, drawing links between their personal memories and the fate of refugees today. These links can be strengthened by the increasingly hostile environments in Britain and America towards Jews. When we engage with personal transnational memory of Kindertransport survivors, it becomes harder for us to ignore the more negative aspects of the history and sensitises us to the impact in the present. It sensitises us to the act in the present. Often, exhibitions, for example, that incorporate testimony do not specifically connect the Kindertransport with human rights discourse. It's very implicit, and you don't always get that, particularly in Britain. New exhibitions in America really do this, and in Australia as well. There was a government exhibition, well, funded government exhibition that really did do this. So in Anne Rigney and Chiara de Cesare's recent edited volume, Transnational Memory, Circulation, Articulation and Scales, they ask two important questions about the future of transnational memory. They are, do the memory cultures among migrant communities replicate those of nationalism or work in a different way? Does the weakening of nationalised memory mark the beginning of the end of historical identity and roots as the principal marker of citizenship and belonging? Thinking about the first question, Kindertransport testimonies can both confirm and challenge national narratives of this historical event. Sometimes Kinder are encouraged to replicate a particular narrative if they are asked leading questions, and I know Annie talked about this in an interview, or they can replicate a narrative they have encountered in the wider historiography and incorporate that into their own stories. Sometimes they generally agree with the national narrative, not that they're agreeing with a national narrative, but their memories show that, which is often celebratory. As we will shortly see, the Kinder live the lessons of the Kindertransport. They really embody them. They implement them in their daily lives. We argue that Kindertransport testimony works in a different way when the Kinder are free to establish their own narratives, and again, Annie picked up on this. The Kinder act upon their ethical conclusions they draw from their narratives as they advocate for refugees in their writings, but also in their physical actions by going to demonstrations. I don't know if you're aware of Lord Dobbs, but he is in the British Parliament and really carries the torch for refugees today. British memory of the Kindertransport has a tendency to see human rights discourse around the Holocaust and the Kindertransport in terms of British values, but the Kindertransport personal transnational memory moves beyond this. So, reflecting on the second question, I suppose it's a yes and no answer. Hannah Zack Miley, who you can see here, this is her autobiography, this is her journey. Kindertransport survivor stated in a recent interview that the Kinder's personhoods were fractured, and for many years they were not at ease. Could we see personal transnational memory then as a means to try and fit the broken pieces back together again? For example, if you include as much as you can in your testimony, you'll patch your life back together in a way. Personal transnational memory, in a sense, has a healing effect because the Kinder reconnect with their past, and this internal dialogue shapes their actions in the present. For example, many Kinder are reclaiming their German and Austrian citizenships, and so is second generation and third, and that's a whole other story. And they are the driving force behind reconciliation. While many kinder feel like they belong somewhere, they also feel that they have to constantly check in with themselves. The kinder have roots in many different places because of their personal transnational journeys. Historically, their identities were problematic, and they readdress this in the present, especially when new crises arise. If we think about historical identity in terms of Germany, Britain, Australia, Israel, for example, the kinder are constantly adapting at the time in the 30s, but also now. And they may have a different relationship to each nation that they've gone to. Their adaptation was different in each case. Instead of a weakening of historical identities as a principal marker of citizenship and belonging, we would argue that kinder bring all their different historical identities together. While the transition from one to another might not always be easy, they are aware of a more aware of a more internal world because of their different national memories. And before I came to this conference, I asked Hannah, I've been interviewing Hannah for about 4 years, and I asked her, you know, we talked about memory, and I didn't want to obviously prompt her to talk about anything, but I did ask her about, you know, this movement that she has in her book, but also when we talk generally. And she replied, "I see a jumble of separate pieces that should fit together, and I'm attempting to make a coherent whole. A late search, almost a compulsion to find meaning, order in the fragmentation. I'm also delighted in the beauty as I catch glimpses of the big picture and the zigzags. That's the way I work on the jigsaw. I may focus on a corner, then turn to laying down the thin frame, only to discover a collection of pieces that fit right in the middle. I make space around each orderly little group. And that's how I zigzag, jumping between past and present, from country to country. Why do I do that? Perhaps it's the way I'm wired. I tend to fully focus on a topic, dig deep, turning from all the other interesting possibilities around me. Perhaps this habit is intensified in old age when my attention span is diminished. There is also the practical reason. More facts and insights come across my path. Over the years, as I've revisited places and met new people, for me, the most important personal reason that I recount my memories in a zigzag form is God. I possess an awareness that He is my Heavenly Father, taking me on this leading journey, and the zigzag parts are caused by the repeated returning to people and the places of pain as I grow in my capacity to trust Him for deeper healing, knowing more of His love. So she's driven to find out who she is. She wants to understand her purpose in life. And if we want to understand the essence of who you are, you don't necessarily start from, birth. You don't jump in and just say an answer straight away. You look for hidden meanings and emotions and the depth. And the kinder that I've interviewed really do this. Obviously, for some it's a way of communicating. It's not measured. They want to talk. They want to think later. Hannah has written her book in sequences and dates, and this was a sort of foundation for her, but she said the interviews moved beyond this, and again, like Annie said, you asked different questions that may not have occurred in the book. She also said that she didn't like systems or order. She was more creative, and this was her personality, but I find this with other kinder as well. And she says you don't necessarily feel in straight lines like you may think in straight lines. So we were thinking about how all this applies to memory now. So I've got 2 pages to go. So I've given you a brief overview of the theory, but I'm going to zigzag myself now and go back in time to come forwards again, as I'll now discuss how I came to this theory. Again, I don't have time to go into detail about the many different Kindertransport interviews that are around the world. There are over 800 in the Shoah Foundation alone. The AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, have just done over 270, not all kinder though, and I've done over 100 myself. But many interviews encourage the kinder to present a linear account, especially the very first interviews. I mean the ones that are held in archives. There are of course exceptions, as some interviews, especially in Australia and Canada, give the survivor more control of the interview process because the interviewer mainly asks follow-up questions. This absence of leading questions allows the survivor to move more freely, often in a way that is not chronological or linear in another way. Their thoughts seem to move by association and from one theme to another. Interviews, for example, that have an explicit and consistent focus on human rights, such as tolerance and personal freedom, then and now, also move around as the Kinder think associatively. The interviewer may ask the Kinder whether they would like to leave a message for future generations at the end of the interview. The Kinder transportee is free to respond or not. So when we see personal transnational memory operating in an institution, but also how an institution is encouraging this because their understanding of the Kinder transport is transnational. However, this is not across the board. When I started doing research for the books, I wanted to understand the Kinder transport in all its complexity, which I'm still learning about, and I've been researching it for 9 years. Although the interviews I've conducted, I've learnt that the Kinder transport is a history of connections, disconnections and reconnections. The Kinder transport is not just a story about being deprived of your rights and then these rights being restored in a host nation. I am nearly done. It's not just a movement from dictatorship.
Enough time, you can breathe.
Okay, sorry. It's not just a movement from dictatorship to democracy, from prejudice to acceptance, from restrictions to opportunities. It's not simply a transition from disconnection to connection. Connections can be imposed and disconnections unwanted. They can be sudden or linear or evolve. The Kinder transport is not about disconnecting from an old reality because, as I'm so often reminded, it is only one event in a person's life. The Kinder transport can therefore be seen as an overlap between different worlds. The Kinder's identities in their lands of birth are not replaced by the link to the host nation. We have to see these connections in terms of layers. We have to read the Kinder stories in full, or learn about them in full when you're interviewing them. The Kinder's identities in their lands of birth are not replaced by, the Kinder's identities in their lands of birth are not replaced by the link in the host nation. We have to see these connections in terms of layers, as I've just said. We must turn all the pages to begin to see how a big chapter the Kinder transport is in their lives. These layers or emotional identifications can create tensions, or they can work together to create something new. Connections are aren't just positive; they can be conflicting and contrasting as the Kinder's identities are constantly shifting. We see this more clearly during the war. They are stripped of their German identities because of their Jewishness. They arrive in Britain as refugees, but then their Germanness is forced back onto them. But their Jewishness could be strengthened or taken from them depending upon who looked after them. A lady talked about conversion as well. That definitely happened to the Kinder. That the Kinder are constantly experiencing reinterpretations of who and what they are, and who they are, and who they are to see themselves as a result in their consciousness decision to connect or reconnect, an act of self-determination. As we will soon read, the link between disconnections and connections is not always clear, and life does not seamlessly start over again in a new country, because this movement is part of one's broader story. Life continues, it picks up in different ways, but it does not totally become estranged from what preceded it. If you ask yourself, who am I, where do I belong, you are reflecting on your origins and how they make sense in the present. Oh, just some conclusions then. So I approached the interviews, as Annie has talked about, with an openness, in the sense that I wanted the survivors to feel that they could talk about anything and explore any possibility. I asked very few questions, and the survivors were free to answer in a chronological way. I didn't obviously force them to zigzag, but they often did zigzag. They were constantly thinking associatively, and one memory leads to another. For example, Hannah started talking about arrival in one place, and then she connected that to arrival in another, and then another. For example, she talked about arriving in Israel, obviously after the war, but then that automatically brought her back to arrival in Britain. Then that took her to arrival in India, where she got married, and there was this really interesting story that was taking place there. So that's when I started to see this pattern of chopping and changing from one event to another. And this non-chronological movement may have been due to the kinder's natural memory flow, but also the openness and randomness of the questions. Often the questions were spontaneous, as I just followed where the kinder were going. Another crucial part of the Testimony Project archive was to interview anyone and everyone connected to the Kindertransport. During the interviews, the kinder spoke about their families and friends, and I wanted to understand more about these relationships. So I started to interview second and third generations, friends, spouses, academics, schools, religious groups, practitioners, and survivors of other genocides. And as a result of this, I came up with a structure for the book. Each chapter follows a theme. So one theme might be the actual journey. At first you read the kinder's stories, but towards the end of the chapter you have second generation reflection on the theme of journeys. I did this because I wanted to understand what other journeys are connected to the initial one. For example, what is the meaning of the Kindertransport to second generation? The later journeys to second generation take to piece their parents' journeys together and understand their lost childhoods. Journeys to dispel myths, journeys to reenact the original journey, so a lot of second gen are going back and retracing this journey. I especially also wanted to think about the dialogue taking place between survivors of different genocides. Through the interviews I discovered just how many kinder and their families are supporting other refugees. When I started to interview the survivors together, I started to think about what these conversations meant. I gave a talk through Boaz's other conference about children, and I talked about reconciliation. I also talked about ethical conclusions and understanding of similar experiences and enabling others to share their stories and heal. So if anybody would like to help me, I need to think more about, I'm going to plug this, why this personal transnational memory focuses on these moments or events, departure, arrival, journeys, both of the kinder and their own families. As the memory does not operate chronologically but moves around, then the significance of these moments and events is felt not to be a result of the sequence, but of something else, which becomes clearer when they are freely associated and compared, when memories are intertwined. So, any thoughts, please? Thank you.